Chances are, if you've clicked on this video, you've experienced some form of rudeness coming from a Chinese tourist.
In a Japanese pharmacy, two Chinese tourists suddenly started arguing and then broke into a fight.
Or maybe you went to China and experienced something like that there. Maybe you saw them spitting in public, or cutting in line, or being too loud in public places.
He was very rude to the ambassador.
I know I've experienced something like that for myself back when I lived in China.
It was like my first month or two there. I was running for exercise. I've always enjoyed it. And in China, the walkways are often uneven. They're built a little bit, I don't know, nonchalantly. And sometimes they plant trees by the roadways, and then the roots from that tree uplift the sidewalk like this, and that makes for a very uneven ground. I was running around the university that I worked at, and I tripped, and I fell, and I got the wind knocked out of me, and my arm was scraped up, and I was really hurt, and I couldn't get up right away because I couldn't really breathe. And I looked around me to see all of these like university students and old people just sort of like looking at me and glaring at me and whispering to each other and kind of walking by me, and no one stopped to help me or ask if I was okay or anything. A lot of them just pretended like it never even happened, like I didn't even exist. I just felt so embarrassed and I was so angry. I thought to myself, geez, like Chinese people are so rude. They're like, what kind of culture is this where you see someone who maybe needs help and you act like they don't even exist? But are they rude?
Or is it just one big cultural misunderstanding? That's what I want to talk about in today's video. Now, I want to preface this by saying I am not here to stereotype anybody or shame anyone. I'm simply trying to share my experiences as a foreigner, as someone who's lived in China, as someone who speaks Chinese, and as someone who has studied these things just for my own interest. I'm not here to misrepresent anyone or their views, so if you have a different take on what I say, feel free to share it in the comment section below. Now, let's get into it. So some of you history buffs out there might be smashing your keyboard trying to type that it's all the government's fault. It's all the CCP fault that Chinese people are so rude, and in fact, they're the root of all evil and the cause of all problems in China. And I hear what you're saying, and you're not wrong per se, but you're also not entirely right, and we'll get into that in a second. But first, let's look at what people mean when they say it's all the government's fault. Really what they're talking about is two periods in history. The first one is the Great Leap Forward, and the second one is the Cultural Revolution. Now, both events were devastating. I'm not gonna get into too many details because it's a little bit complicated, but briefly, Great Leap Forward was economic and social policies put in by the government to try and change China from more of an agriculture society into an industrial one. And so they essentially made every single farmer in China produce like iron and steel. And there was a whole bunch of other things that they did, like change the way the whole farming system worked in China, and it failed. It didn't just fail, it devastated the country and led to the greatest famine human history has ever seen. It was really, really bad. Many people, tens of millions of people starved to death. There were reports of people eating tree bark and grass or each other to survive. And as you can imagine, when the country is in such horrible levels of poverty, you can't really focus on things like culture. A few years later, in comes the Cultural Revolution, which was another terrible idea. It was a bunch of social reforms aimed at changing the very social fabric that made up China. It radicalized the youth, and basically what they wanted to do was destroy anything resembling traditional Chinese culture, values, traditions, you name it. Basically what that means is if you were, say, I don't know, 20 years old in China, and you saw someone who was above you in economic standing or in the social class, you were basically free to publicly shame them or just straight up kill them. You know, you'd have like young students, I am lost, you would have young students go into old tombs, say like a Ming Dynasty tomb where they may have buried an emperor, and they would desecrate the tomb. They would burn old priceless books. They would destroy historical sites. You name it, anything that looked old, anything that resembled Chinese culture was destroyed because they were trying to make China a new country, something that could grow, something that was more powerful. Lots of people lost their lives, teachers, professors, writers, authors, anyone who like had an education was basically disappeared during this time. And this is the main event. This is the thing that really brought China to its knees. While it does explain one or two generations of Chinese people who sort of, I don't know, lack culture, if that makes sense, it doesn't explain the whole thing. And the people who grew up during these times is actually called the lost generation. And I've met a lot of them, and they're often very brash, lacking in tact. They say things that are a little shocking, and they're very, very different from the younger Chinese people who didn't grow up during that time. There's a big divide between these generations. I actually find it surprising how in the West, or at least in Canada where I grew up, we didn't learn about these things at all. We learned about, communism in Russia, we learned about Nazi Germany, we learned about World War II in general, but we never learned about communism in China, which I think is a big mistake, because if you search for who is responsible for the most human deaths in history, it's Mao Zedong, right? The leader of the Communist Party when all of this was happening, give or take, right? If you can attribute all those deaths personally to him. And we just don't learn about it in Canada. No, we don't learn about the devastation that happened there, which I think is crazy. But again, it's not the full answer. In order to find the full answer, we have to look a little bit deeper. In order to do so, I'm going to be referencing this book. It's called My Country and My People by Lin Yutang. This is not a sponsor, by the way. I just find this book really good. It's a book that lays out what Chinese culture is in a way that you can understand. There's an English version, by the way, if you want to pick one up.
The reason, by the way, that we're referencing this book in particular is because it was written in the 30s. That was before communism had taken over China and controlled it. And so we know that we can eliminate the communist part of this equation and just look at the core of Chinese culture.
In this book, he talks about the Chinese character. He talks about Chinese people are like, and one of the characteristics in this book that he mentions is a lack of social mind. Chinese people don't have a social mind. What does that mean? Well, a social mind is something like in the West, which we do have, where you might have a church group where you have a whole bunch of people of similar faith that come together and sing songs or chat or whatever, and they're strangers, but they can still come together. Or sporting events like cricket or hockey or football or soccer, where you have two teams that play against each other, two teams that don't know each other. Any kind of social settings where you have a whole bunch of strangers that have no connections to each other, that come together to hang out or play together or do whatever, is a sort of social mind. And traditionally speaking, Chinese people don't have this. If you look at Chinese games, they didn't really have sports per se. It was very individualistic. Think like Mahjong or something like that, where yes, there are people playing together, but the focus is more on the individual, not necessarily on team play or getting to know someone that you maybe didn't know originally. What Chinese people do have is a familial mind. They focus more on the family and people that they know. That means that they don't pay any mind to strangers or people who are outside of their immediate zone of influence, so to speak. Chinese people will pretty much only focus on immediate family, friends of the family, and anything that happens beyond that is beyond their control and therefore deemed not worthy of their attention, so to speak. It's something like, if there's enough rice on my table, if there's a roof over my head, and my family is together, then I'm not going to concern my things with how the country is going, or policies that the government is enacting, or all of these things that you can't influence or have no effect on. They don't even pay any attention to. They're very much a pragmatic people. And so the end result of that is that if a Chinese person doesn't know someone else, there's no need to be courteous to them or even polite to them. You may as well act like that person doesn't even exist. And to other people, like Western people, this can come off as extremely rude and is the root cause of why things like cutting in line happen, or for example, my story of when I fell over happened. It's because they don't know me, and to insert themselves in someone else's affairs can cause unnecessary risk to them, and so they don't bother doing it.
There is, of course, a problem with referencing this book, and that's because, again, it was written in the 30s, and Mr. Lin Yutang, the author here, was writing about China from the lens of which the time that he lived in. China has changed a lot since the 1930s. It was almost 100 years ago, and so it's not a perfect look at what Chinese people are like today, but it is a good view of the core, the heart, the central values of Chinese culture, and that's why I chose this book.
And so all of this begs the question, why aren't Taiwanese people like this? Why aren't Taiwanese people so rude? Because, everyone's claiming that Taiwan is the real China, or you'd at least have to admit that Taiwan is under heavy Chinese influence because of its history, and yet Taiwanese people are so different. They're not considered rude. They don't have this reputation. And I think there's two reasons for this. The first reason is globalization and how it affects both places. You know, China is a very isolated country, and it's not easily influenced by outside sources. China changes based on what happens within the country, not with what happens outside the country. Whereas Taiwan is a lot more open to foreign ideas, to other ideas, and so while it does have a lot of Chinese cultural influence, it's affected a lot more by outside sources, and Taiwanese people are a lot more well-traveled than Chinese people, typically speaking. And so what you'll notice is that the culture gap between someone like myself, who's Canadian, and your average Taiwanese person isn't that big. Compared to, say, your average Chinese person. It's very common for some Chinese people to never leave their hometown, and so the way that they think and the way that they go about things is a lot different. If you go to China and you meet people, you'll notice a big difference between people who have left China and people who have never left China. The second reason is that Taiwan has never been under communist control, and so of course it never went through a cultural revolution or a great leap forward. That's not to say that the government was particularly good in Taiwan. It was still a single-party dictatorship back then. But they saw what was happening in China. They saw, you know, the Cultural Revolution, and they saw Chinese people absolutely tearing Chinese culture to the ground, absolutely burning it. And they went the opposite direction. They thought, well, why don't we promote Chinese culture? Why don't we promote going to temples and praying and, you know, the Chinese public holidays and all the things that come with being quote-unquote Chinese? And they did. And so Taiwanese people are sometimes a lot more traditionally Chinese than actual Chinese people are, in some ways more than others. Also, Taiwan's a much smaller country with a much lower population than China, and so they don't have this attitude of ignoring people they don't know. They're still very polite and courteous. So, are Chinese people simply rude, or is it a cultural misunderstanding? Well, I guess that depends. When I first moved to China and I didn't understand the people very well, I certainly thought that they were very rude. But once I learned more and I started speaking with people more and spent more time in this side of the world, I came to understand their culture on a deeper level, which is what I'm hoping to do for you in this video. I came to understand that it's just a different way of looking at things, and I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found it helpful. If you think I deserved it and you got something from this video, hit the subscribe button. It would really help me out, and I would really, really appreciate it. You can also follow me on Instagram at Prosy_SR, and yeah, stay positive, keep your stick on the ice, and I'll catch you guys next week for another video.